I'm going to have to start over, aren't I? I just realized that my audio wasn't picking up because my program was not set to the right microphone. Let me start all over. Ignore that first part of silence. Welcome to Tiny Desk Sermon. We're going to look at the readings for Lectionary 21C, and year C is the year of Luke's Gospel. And it's always important to know which Gospel you are reading, because each one has a unique approach to what the good news is. And Luke's in particular has got some important themes that are unique to Luke. And that comes through in today's reading in a really interesting way. So I want to touch on that when we get there, and especially now that you can actually hear me. So let's go straight to the reading. I'm not looking at the other ones today. So, Luke 13, 10 to 17. Now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. Excuse me. All right. I assume it's a familiar story to many of you, and within the story there are a lot of familiar elements. So I want to touch on a little bit of the particulars here, and then talk about Luke's Gospel and how it shapes the way we hear this story. So the context here is a healing on the Sabbath, and there are numerous stories about this in at least 3 of the Gospels. And what's the issue at stake here? The issue at stake is that on the Sabbath, which of course in the Jewish biblical tradition is Saturday, Friday night to Saturday night, you aren't to do work. And then a lot of traditions developed about, well, what counts as work and what doesn't. And even can you do something to save a life on the Sabbath? And the traditions end up saying, yes, you can. And then the conversation becomes, well, what about something that isn't life-saving, necessary for saving life, but is helpful to someone who's suffering? And there seemed to be less agreement on that. So what's happening here is a healing on the Sabbath that falls into this disputed gray area of Jewish tradition and teaching. So Jesus seems to have no hesitation to help a woman who is clearly, visibly in pain and being diminished by the problems in her back. And he noticed that this is not one of those healing stories where this woman expresses this great faith in Jesus and reaches out to him and say, "Jesus, please help me." He notices her, and he calls her over. And he says, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." Nothing was required from the woman, not an expression of faith, not an appeal. Jesus is acting on his own volition because he sees somebody so impacted by her ailment and for so long. So when the leaders of the synagogue object to Jesus healing on the Sabbath, he helps them think through a little bit of their own approach to the Sabbath, which is, well, don't you do work to have your animals get water on the Sabbath so they can survive? And of course they have to admit yes. And then of course the point then being, isn't this woman, who's a daughter of Abraham, who is, a sister of the community, isn't she a lot more important than your animals that you have no qualms about helping out on the Sabbath? So he catches them in their hypocrisy, and hopefully they were able to see and have a little more understanding. So now let's back up for a second and think about a few of the issues going on in this text. Luke's gospel begins with a strong theme. The first 4 chapters laying the foundation for the theme of Luke's gospel, which is that God is acting through Jesus to lift up the lowly. And I want you to keep that phrase in mind, lifting up the lowly, and liberating people from whatever oppresses them. And God is doing this through acts of mercy and through offering forgiveness. Particularly forgiveness for those who have been part of the things that have been keeping people down. So, when we get to this story, we've already seen several healing stories. But here we have a visual and physical representation of what Mary sang about in her Magnificat, what Jesus talked about when he said his purpose in chapter 4, quoting in Isaiah, was to bring liberation. And what you have is a woman bent over, literally lowly in her position. Because if somebody is bent over and can't really look up or look people in the eye, it's a forced physical position of lowliness. And then what does this healing bring to her? But she stood up straight and began praising God. And if you think about just the position of a body that is in a mode of praising God, it is not likely to be a bent over position. It's a position of something like this. Even the capacity to be able to look upward, which is a position of kind of joy and turning to God and all that, was something she couldn't do. And now she is lifted up and set free from her ailment. She's liberated. And her life has changed. Not only is she freed from pain, but she is freed from the sort of forced lowliness that was put upon her. And she is now in a position to be able to praise God. I don't know how much praising of God she was doing before this. She may have been grumbling for 18 years, and rightfully so. But now she is physically able to even move her body in a way that praises God. So the entire theme of Luke's gospel is embodied in this story, lifting up the lowly. And bringing them into a new relationship with society, with neighbor, and with God. And that's what happens to her. And Jesus does this without even asking her, without even waiting for her to ask, and without worry about what people will think in doing it. And that seems to be essential to this story. Now, it's, if you stop and think about it, okay, it's the Sabbath. This woman's been bound up for 18 years with back pain. Couldn't she have just waited one more day? so it wasn't the Sabbath. And that's what the leaders are saying. What's the big deal waiting one more day? Well, apparently, when Jesus comes on the scene, the two ways to think about this. One is that there's no bad day to bring healing. There's no bad day. There's no wrong day to lift people up. There's no reason that somebody should have to wait another day before they can be liberated from whatever is holding them down. There's no good day that somebody should have to endure another day of back pain or whatever it is their ailment is. If they can be liberated from it, they should. Because this is the true expression of God's intentions for Sabbath and for all of human life. So it's really interesting, this idea that, yes, Jesus could have waited one more day. She could have waited one more day, probably would not have complained a bit about it, but Jesus said, today, this needs to happen now. And so here's what I'm pondering about this text for us. The context of the controversy is a community of people that take Sabbath keeping very seriously. And nowhere is that dismissed by Jesus as a wrong thing to do. Taking Sabbath seriously is the right thing to do, but it has to get reinterpreted through the lens of mercy. And if there's any major theme in Luke's gospel other than liberation and lifting up the lowly, it is mercy. So it isn't a dispute about whether Sabbath is good or not. It's about how to do it in a way that truly reflects God's intentions. But here's my thought for us. I don't think we're people who take Sabbath very seriously at all. Now, by Sabbath, we don't mean getting up Sunday morning and going to church. That's sort of the Christian, especially American Protestant or American religious view about keeping Sabbath means getting up Sunday morning and going to church. And that has very little, if anything, to do with the biblical notion of Sabbath. Sabbath keeping is about stopping work for several reasons. One, to be able to enjoy the life that God has given us and give praise to God for that life. Two, to stop engaging in the means of earning money and spending money, but rather living in the gift of the abundance of what we already have. So it's a momentary disengaging from the economy, because we are shaped by the economic realities of life 6 other days a week, and we have to pull out of it one day a week to really not be completely defined by it. And then the third thing that happens in Sabbath keeping is that it also applies to servants, slaves, workers, anybody who's sort of beneath you in a sort of social hierarchy thing. I don't mean that literally. And I don't mean that people who work for other people are beneath them, but we structure ourselves that way. They must also be given Sabbath rest. So Sabbath has a lot going on. And what does it say that we, even, people of faith, biblical faith in our modern day context, give almost no credence to the importance of Sabbath keeping? What does this story mean to us when we don't take Sabbath seriously? And we kind of like these Sabbath breaking stories of Jesus because they sort of liberate us from having to take Sabbath seriously, because we just say, well, see, Sabbath doesn't matter. It does matter a lot in this story to Jesus and to the other people, but it's being reinterpreted, or it's being given its full expression in Jesus. So what does the story mean for people who don't observe Sabbath? Who people like us who sort of work constantly and consume endlessly 7 days a week. So what would it mean for us to prioritize what's happening in this story, healing and lifting others up over our need to work and earn and spend money 7 days a week. To me, we have to almost ask the inverse questions about Sabbath. Not Sabbath day, but the other 6 days of the week, which for us have become 24/7. What does it mean to think that we would stop prioritizing our work and our earning and our consuming so that we can show mercy to people who are needing lifting up? That's the only way I can think of to really let the challenge of this text speak to us, because we aren't really Sabbath-keeping people. I don't mean to offend anybody. If you feel like you're keeping Sabbath by going to church on Sunday and all that, that's great. But that's not really the focus of the biblical understanding of Sabbath-keeping. So I think that's very challenging, because I think we're so focused on this constant need to work, earn, and consume that the needs of others, the call to show mercy, is constantly limited by our focus 7 days a week on earning and consuming. So I think that's a worthy challenge for us to hear in this text. And, so maybe if you reverse the story and say, well, Jesus was healing a woman, and the doctors and the hospitals and the pharmaceutical companies say, well, you can't do that because now she won't have to spend all her money on our healthcare services. And Jesus would say, the economy is important, but liberating people and lifting them up through mercy is more important. That might be a way to hear the inverse of this text that I think maybe applies more to our situation than others. Does this make any sense? I'm thinking this through, and I'm trying to hear the relevance of this text in our context. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about keeping Sabbath. I think we should. I think there should continue. I've spent 20 years studying and thinking about the significance of the Sabbath-keeping commandment, the only one in the 10 Commandments that we kind of say doesn't apply to us anymore, why that is important. Because imagine now, if we were trying to keep Sabbath as seriously as this text, the people in this text, including Jesus, do, then 1 day a week we are being forced to get out of our constant work, money, consumption-focused lives, and to just get a break from that. And how that would open us up to opportunities for showing mercy when we are less focused on our need to consume and earn. So I think there's a lot of important stuff to consider about what Sabbath keeping means for a religious community like us or anybody involved in a church anywhere. And yet we just don't really think it is that important in terms of sort of practically speaking. One thing I admire about many of the traditions alive today in Judaism around Sabbath keeping is that you take it seriously, and you have rituals and customs and rules that help you focus on it, because nothing in your life is going to say you should take Sabbath seriously and take a break from all that stuff that we do and reconnect to what life is really about and what God is really about. Nothing is telling us to do that. So it takes a tradition, a community, to take Sabbath keeping seriously and to practice it together. Then you can discuss, as we were saying earlier, how do we do that faithfully? How do we do that well? How do we do it in a way that's life-giving? And what the story we hear today is saying, how do we do that in a way that helps us show mercy, not restrict mercy? So that's my kind of challenging thought for myself and for us today. I love how this story is a visual illustration of Luke's gospel, that lifting up the lowly is what the good news is about, and to ponder how this woman's life is transformed by now being able to stand up straight, to be not only be free of pain, but to be reconnected to people in a way she wasn't before, and to be physically able to stand up straight and praise God. That is all a metaphor, an illustration of what the good news in Luke is all about. So part of our pondering is also to wonder how do we help lift people up, even if we can't heal their infirmities. How do we lift people up so they have the dignity and the connection in community and the sense of God's grace and blessing in their lives? How do we help lift people up? And also, in doing that, you're bringing people into the circle of community more centrally. All those things could be faithful ways of thinking about how we live out the meaning of this text. Even if we can't cure everybody's back pain, and if anybody's ever had back pain, you know how limiting and difficult it can be to live with that. I've been having a little bit of myself recently, and ironically enough, one way I try to deal with lower back pain is to keep a better posture of being upright. And there's something about that that just changes how you think about your body and your kind of your outlook. So that's all curious and interesting to me. All right, that is my take on this wonderful story. I hope this is giving you some initial challenging, helpful thoughts about it. We'll see where the sermon goes on Sunday. I see Cassie saying, yes, it seems to make sense what I was saying. I think that's what the yes is referring to, so thank you for that. I'll keep trying to make it make more sense for Sunday. I have just put out today a survey on adult forums for the fall. I would love to have you take 2 minutes tops to click on that link and fill it out and let me know your interest on topics, formats, days and times, so that I can do some planning in the next few weeks to get ready for the fall. There are other things coming up, especially a week from Sunday. Former Vicar Kelsey Kress will be back with us to preach and to be able to reconnect with people that she didn't get to say goodbye to in the way we like to do when an intern leaves, because it was the first few months of the pandemic. So we're just overjoyed to welcome her back and look forward to having her preach. And I look forward to having a Sunday where I get to listen to someone preach. That's a nice treat for me. All right. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to get to see you soon.